So this video will focus on Weird West because it's very apparent by just the first impressions that there has been a very big emphasis on presentation and also effectiveness of how this interface has been designed. So we will look at these points through this video by playing the first section of the game. So this is almost the first screen you see in the game, and it's made of a very black background and some particles moving on top, swaying to the sides with some soft animations. So the obvious reason as to why we would have animated elements in the interface on loading screens is that we want to inform the player that the game has not crashed at this point. There's stuff happening. And the way they've solved this in the screen is by including a variation of hue and lightness in the center of the screen. And this graphical element really draws on the classical, traditional cowboy aesthetics, the themes, with the sunset and the sun reflecting off the mountains. So even with these simplest graphical elements in interface, they're trying to capture this feeling of being exposed to the West, the cowboy life. There's also a very big Western type of font, thematically on point. Also a very big A button here with some dust inside. So they really carry over the Western theme into the visuals on the interface. But there is also a noticeable emphasis on effectiveness of the text. So underneath we have a font which is a lot more easier to read because we want to read more of this text. So if it was just this capitalized and very narrow kerning on the font, then it would be harder to read these paragraphs. Also we see it in the game itself, a bit more comic book-like font here. There's also use of portraits within the game space, so when a important character speaks, they have a portrait next to them, so they are easier to remember, because there's not a lot of fidelity in the character models of the in-game, so they need these detailed portraits with the faces on them so people can remember faces and start associating characters to the story visually, instead of just remembering names, which is very hard as the game progresses, at least. So this game uses something that some academics might call a world-oriented composite interface, which basically entails that the game information with the overlay and the HUD and so on is sort of compressed into the game space and takes up as little space as possible. You can see an example of this in how the button prompts are placed next to the object. So when the player goes close to an object in the game which they can engage with certain actions like button prompts, these button prompts and information is listed right next to the item within the game world. So the player never has to look around on the screen in different places to figure out what actions or interactions can be done to an object and which button to press to perform those actions. You can also see how the inventories are done in the same way. They are always in the center, or they're anchored at the same place on the screen a bit to the side. So the gaze of the player never leaves this game space unless they really want to look around for something else. Another sign that this was their basic philosophy with designing this interface is how they are implementing the your inventory as well. So you just press the Y button and then you open up the inventory next to it. So you don't have to leave the current game situation too much to look into your own inventory. You have some basic information like how much is in there. So you have the 4 out of 45, for instance. You also have stuff like bullets on the side there. What's interesting is that you can actually use the overflow scrolling. Even though there's no items in inventory where you're looking, there's still an overflow option here. You can use the right thumbstick to move through the inventories. That's a bit interesting. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it has something to do with the learning. So they want to learn the player early before they start thinking about other things. Another thing I also want to praise is that the cursor is always moved to where the inventory starts. So the first item in inventory is where the cursor is when you open up the inventory. That's a very good way of alleviating the player from having to move the cursor around the screen too much. Because it can be a bit annoying with these floating cursors that you have to move them around with a joystick and then it takes a long time to move it around. So here's the first instance of a dialogue. And you can see how they're using a gentle fading in and out glow behind the portrait and the text box to create a bit of an effect of a figure and ground, if you think about the Gestalt theory principle. So this puts the text box and the portrait on another layer from the background, which is the game world in the back, and then you have an intermediate layer between them, which is this column of black. But it really emphasizes the portraits in this game, like the faces are important. It's very easy to remember characters based on these portraits, and they're you can see in the future they are fairly unique from each other, so they're fairly easy to remember. The names are a bit drowned out here, so it's sort of in line with the rest of the text, so it gets kind of drowned out, but there are a bit of a bolder font on them, like the font weight is bolder. So it becomes a bit easier just to skip that part and start reading the actually dialogue text. Also, we can take note that the lines don't go so far out. There's some research that suggests that it causes less eye strain if the lines are not, I think it was not wider than about 80 characters or something like this. I don't quite remember the numbers here. Basically, the research suggests that people can read easier, or it feels easier to read when you're switching lines more often. But the downside is that you actually read slower when it's broken at so many points. If the lines are longer, you can read faster, but there's something about the general enjoyment of reading the text that is tied to the length of each line. So here in this game they use very short lines. It cuts very frequently, or the line break is very frequent. So if we consider that research and what we're seeing on screen where the line breaks is very frequent, they're probably going for a reading experience which is more pleasurable, because it's dialogue given text. They don't have to talk so much, so you don't need long lines. So there's both benefits in how the reading experience is, according to that research I'm quoting, and how you are freeing up the space on the right side of the screen to look into the scenery, and also you can look at the characters in the scene. They have these boxes, dialogue boxes above their heads, so that also indicates who's doing the talking inside the 3D space of the game world. This might be important if you have to prepare for some battle or something, so you understand where people are standing relative to where you are. So you can sort of prepare because you know who did the talking, who is aggressive, who is kind, and so on. You can also emphasize how they use color in the dialogue screen here. They use yellow and blues, and we gotta remember some people, or many people, don't see these colors so well. But they're also made in italic. The blue text in the dialogue text is made in italic, so even people who have reduced color vision might be able to identify that this or these words are emphasized in some way. That's also a very good example of how they are putting in notifications, because it has like a sliding motion coming into the screen from the right. And that's pretty important because the peripheral vision is not really trained well to discover things that just pop in. It's very bad at seeing stuff that just pops in immediately and has no motion, because the peripheral vision is more trained to identify some specific face expressions like fear and disgust, and it does not notice happy faces that well. It's trained to identify very specific faces, and also motion, unexpected motion, is very effective. So this UI element is called a modal usually in web design, and its purpose is to stop the user from interacting with the page in general and just focus on that specific window. Modals usually require the user to do some specific task to close it, and in this case it's to click the close button at the bottom here. But the reason they would have done this in the game is basically to take the player out of the game context where they have to think about getting harmed or so on, so they can just focus on what's on the text there, so they can read it and understand it in a peaceful context. So when they click the close button, they go back into the game context where they can start engaging with the game again. We can also note here how they are exposing locked functions in the same screen space. Like, I can't bury a corpse here because I don't have a shovel, but I am notified or informed of the possibility of that this mechanic actually exists in the game. We also have to take note of this sound cue. So we have already picked up a lot of items in the game and engaged with a lot of inventories, but we have never heard that sound before. And that really stuck out in the game when I was playing it, and it kind of notifies me that something happened here. There was an event that took place in the game. I'm not sure what the consequences are of it yet. It could be in a narrative, I don't know. But it was definitely an effect I picked up on, and I kind of understand that something special happened when I picked up this item. We can also look at how they are using information by incorporating symbols into the frames of these items. So we see here's an example of how they use particle effects with these healing icons, green crosses, which are pretty common. They usually tend to be red or whatever, but it's, you know. But yeah, actually you get an opportunity as a player to learn how the interaction with these sorts of items are. And you also get to differentiate between the items you can eat from inventory with the fruits and the raw food here, which you can actually bring with you. They are both identified as food by the player, but they don't have this particle effect. And this repeats in different inventories. Like here again, you see you have this particle effect around these fruits, and then you realize, okay, I can't bring this with me, and I probably have full HP, so I don't need to eat these fruits anymore. And I can leave them there to eat them at a later point if I need more healing. Also, you notice this spade icon had a green arrow inside of it. So we might suspect it has something to do with stats or improvement, like something is better, something is worse. And now that the player has obtained another item, they want to start experimenting. So as you can see here, I'm walking around, I'm seeing these blue circles in the ground, I'm pressing different keys to see if I can use the shovel. And I discover how I can kick stuff by accident and so on. And now I'm sort of learning, okay, maybe the shovel is meant for very specific spots, like there's game objects within the game space that I have to identify and walk over, and then I can dig it up. So the player here gets to experiment with using the shovel or trying to apply it places, but when applying it to stuff fails, then they start to lower their expectations, and then they get to walk up to the mound where they had to dig up, and then they start to learn and accept the system limitations. And limitation is not necessarily a bad thing in games. We want to achieve a game flow. So when we learn the systems, when they are clear what they are and what they are not, then we can actually achieve game flow. So this section here actually allows the player to walk around and try to apply it, but when they learn that you can't apply it, you have to apply it to very specific things, they are learning how to get a game flow going. So earlier I mentioned the importance of motion in the interface when you want to draw attention to something. And I can give an example here, because in the game I actually didn't notice these new elements at the bottom of the screen. I didn't notice immediately that there was a portrait of me and that there was some information like HP and the weapon I'm holding. And I didn't even notice the this action point system bar, which is on the bottom right. And I didn't really notice the radar system at the top right either. But again, they were not really that important at the exact moment of gameplay here, so it's okay that I just notice it after a while. It's not a huge issue. And here we can see the wheel menu, where we can see the weapons we have equipped. And it carries a lot of information here. We have the amount of bullets we have on top, we have the name in the middle, we also had a type of a weapon that it is, we also had the damage. We also have a small icon next to the damage text, so we begin to expect there may be different types of damage. So the game so far hasn't really explicitly explained to you that there are different damage types, but when they expose these things in interface, you start to expect these things. And it's doing this by not overloading you with a lot of information, but it does allow you to build an expectation as to where this game will go further on. And then the game starts switching its weather, and then you start to learn that things can become wet, and then you're starting to think, okay, maybe there's elemental stuff in the combat system and how you can engage with this world. You started to think about the abiotics, like when it starts raining, it opens up the game for more ways to play. And it's also timely with the story events. You're burying your son. It's very dramatic to have rain and darkness when you're doing this. So it's a way of using the environmental weather as a way of setting the mood, and also hinting at more game mechanics that can affect how you will plan ahead and how you will play this game. This is how navigating the menus looks like, and as you can see, it's very quick. You don't have to wait long for the next screen to be legible. The way the transition works here is that it blinks out the current screen and blinks in the next screen, but it gives the next screen a bit of a shove or a bit of a transition to the side. And it's very subtle, but it's just slow enough for you to notice it, but it's not slow enough for you to become a timely hindrance in doing whatever task you're setting up to do in the menus. And there's absolutely no perceivable limitation to how quickly you can switch between these either. So you can be very quick. You can actually see a small bug there with abilities that get stuck up there, but it's a bug that nobody cares about. And which tab is active is very apparent. It has a very bright lightness to it. It also uses the underfit hue with the gold and yellow color against the black and white inactive tabs. You can also notice a very gentle effect there, where when the color and the lightness has gone away, there's still a bit of a trace of the texture that is overlying there that remains for a little bit longer than the color and the hue, the lightness hue. It's very gentle, but it's actually noticeable, and it feels very nice to have that slight hovering effect after you switch this tab. So here we can have a look at the merchant menu, and we can see how they try to differentiate between the merchant and your inventory. So the merchant is on the left, which you can see by the portrait of the guy. There's also the icon of the cash register, which you might see in Western movies and so on. Very classical imagery there. It's also very explicitly mentioned in his title, which is next to his portrait. Then on the right side you have your inventory explicitly spelled out in the title. You also have a different symbol, which is your backpack, and you also finally have your portrait. And your inventory is interesting that they write it that way, because that could imply that the other characters you will play in the future might also share the same inventory, because it's not the character's inventory or her name specifically, it's your in the general term as you as a player. But that might be reading too much into it. It could just be a simplification. So finally we can look at the bottom elements of the screen, like the HUD, and how they have done the visual layout of these elements, and how they explicitly draw parallels as to how you would see the button layouts on the controller itself as well. And then we can compare this to how the experience would be by using a keyboard and mouse, where the visual layout of the HUD does not really correspond to how the keys are laid out on the keyboard. So we can see in the lower right corner where we have the A, X, Y, and B buttons, we can see that the skill I'm trying to use is placed on the B button, but I don't really get the explicit prompt to press the B button before I'm holding the right bumper button. By having this element always on screen, we can train ourselves through repetition priming and also perceptual priming, because we can always look down to this portion of the screen and remind ourselves which button I have to press to use this skill, even when I don't directly have to use it. But as we switch over to keyboard and mouse, this layout benefit doesn't really carry over to the keyboard and mouse setup, because the layout of the buttons on the HUD does not really correspond to how they are laid out on the keyboard. We can see on the screen that if I press 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm activating and using the skills. So if you wanted to follow again this principle of having the buttons on the HUD correspond to the layout of the controllers we're using, these buttons would now be in a row horizontally across the screen. We can also see this occurring problem on the left screen with the items. These are also in a circular pattern which corresponded to the direction of the D-pad on the controller. But I think that covers the basics here, but of course there's a lot more to go in here. You can even see it in this clip there with the integrated icons there that kind of communicates the awareness of each enemy, and also you have elemental markers, so if they have oil in them or water, if they're on fire and so on, it's all conveyed in there. This is also a bit interesting that I would have liked to brought up earlier in the video. You can see if I first noticed the use bandages message, and then I'm looking down to the item thing to see which button I had to press to actually use the bandage. So that might have been interesting if they had the button prompt next to the message on the middle of the screen. Then I wouldn't have to look down to the item to see which button I had to press to actually use it. Because as you can see here, they actually have the button prompt next to the reload message, but it's not next to the use bandage message. So that is something I probably would have liked to have in this situation when I was playing. Anyway, I'm gonna finish now, or I will never finish.